Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of A Fork in Time. This is Kai in the host chair today, and joining me is the triumvirate of guest hosts today, and we're going to have a very interesting topic on hand. Before I get into that, though, let's do some perfunctory introductions. In no particular order, I have joining me His Illustriousness, Mr. Evan Buck.
Hey, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan.
And joining me as well to complete the triumvirate is His Excellency, Dylan Holzimer.
At the risk of copyright infringement, I will say, hi, good people.
Oh,
yes. And in doing so, he brings up a very important point, which is we are missing our resident economic analyst, Mr. Chris Coppola. We are mourning his loss, even though he did not die. He's just absent from this podcast. So we will hope to do him justice by spearheading this venture without him. Speaking of the venture,
I mean,
today
is he
we
gonna let us put this up now that Dylan pilfered his intro?
He better.
No,
that's an open question.
We've infringed on copyright now, so what's the point?
Yeah, so might as well just pack him and go.
As the podcast lawyer, I hereby decree we're fine.
Okay, sounds good. We have our legal analyst.
It's fair. It's fair use.
Hear us. Yeah, it's
Fair use. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So, speaking of the venture at hand today, we have a very interesting topic. We're heading to a region which I think has been very seldom covered, if at all, and that is the region of
Oxania?
Does anybody want to help me? Yes.
Yeah.
And we're going to be talking about a very important fellow there. His name is Tamerlane, or Timur. And to explain this further, I'll toss it over to Dylan.
Yeah. Thank you, Kai, for the wonderful intro. Basically, we're going back to essentially kind of the far Middle East, Central Asia, Northern India, that rough region. We're heading back to the end of the 14th century and into the 15th century to the last of the great Mongol conquerors, or Mongol descent conquerors, Tamerlane, if you like reading Ivanhoe and Walter Scott. His real name was Timur. He was also known as Timur Ileng, the Lame, which is, bastardized into Western English, Romanticist literature as Tamerlane. He, like I said, he's basically the last of these great Mongol Turkic conquerors. He starts his sort of whirlwind of conquest in 1366, and by the time he's done, he rules what is essentially an empire that stretches over all of modern Persia, all the way into Tbilisi in Georgia, in Anatolia, Aleppo in Syria, goes all the way on the eastern end into Delhi in, what we would modern day think of as India, and goes all the way from the sort of Straits of Hormuz in Iran on the Persian Gulf into Otrar in Kazakhstan. So basically, this guy conquers a giant swath of kind of the classic, Central Asian Mongol steppe, Persia, Anatolia, and a good chunk of Pakistan and kind of northwest modern India. So this is a huge swath of territory. And he does this basically in the space of about 40 years. He's conquered all this, and he ends up going on a attack against Ming China in 1404, 1405, and he ends up catching a fever. Now, one thing to know about Timur, most of his conquests he led in the spring and summer months. It's that classic kind of, campaign season. You don't want to campaign during the winter because you've got to get your house in order. If there's any crops that need gathering, you need to gather them and feed, basically everybody. This isn't, where you can work a W-2 at your capitalist job and, get a paycheck. You kind of have to go home and take care of the farm, and then you come back and you fight the next spring. But Timur...
he violated the basic tenet of warfare, which is never start a land war in Asia and never fight to the death or with a Sicilian or
I was
something.
going to say we don't have any
However,
Sicilians yet, but they might come in
Right.
later. But yeah.
Yeah.
So Timur engages. Basically, the long and the short of it is he gets a letter from the Ming emperor who essentially refers to him as a vassal or a subject instead of a co-monarch. And Timur takes this, as one might say, to quote The Last Dance with Michael Jordan, if you've seen the meme, and I took that personally. So Timur decides he's going to get revenge on the Ming and teach them a lesson for insulting him and belittling him. And so he launches this winter campaign against the Ming. And he wins a couple of minor battles, a couple of minor skirmishes. And he's basically in the winter of 1405, he's traveling to a forward camp and he catches ill and he dies. So in our timeline, that sets off kind of a succession crisis. There is an eventual victor who is not his sort of presumed heir. He never officially named an heir. He'd done it a couple times and they died. So he said, all right, clearly the third time is not the charm. I'm just going to quit naming heirs and they can figure it out.
And basically there was a pox on his sons.
Yeah.
And his first son, I think, died, predeceased him. I think a second one did too. One of them ended up contracting severe gout and falling off his horse. Literally fell off his high horse. So Timur was like, yeah, probably not the best pick. And so the last son, he was like, yeah, I think he's a little too meek. I think he's a little too mild-mannered of a guy to rule. So I'm going to nominate my
grandson. Yeah.
My grandson. If you're one of the two remaining
eldest
sons,
who he preferred.
Actually of the second eldest.
Actually, no, I was going to say, yeah.
So his eldest son died in the 1370s, so he's out. The second son is the one who he initially nominated. He died. Then he's like, well, crap. Okay, I'll go down the line. Nominates that second son's first son. He dies. Those are the two official nominations. And then after that, he says, all right, well, screw this. We're just going to assume that everybody knows that grandson number 2 of son number 2 is going to be my heir. But he never actually says that, and nobody likes the poor kid. And so that, when he dies, kicks off this whole dust up. The end of which, his third son, his fourth son, the crazy son is the third son. His fourth son becomes the emperor, rules for 10, 15 years. Then another succession crisis kicks off. Basically, every time there's a ruler change, they do this. And eventually, after 40 or 50 or 60 years, the Timurids have kind of fractured into a sense where they only really control the main cities of Samarkand and Iraj, I think is the other one. I forget the name. But basically, they dissolve into...
It's like a passage from Matthew where it's so-and-so begets so-and-so begets so-and-so begets so-and-so begets so-and-so. And
exactly.
It's just twin genealogies, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Do not read Mongol family trees with titles attached. It's a bad way to go nowhere. But basically...
Like the opposite of royal family, of English royal family trees.
Yeah, pretty much. But basically, the Timurids only really last, maybe, to be generous, 125 years. But where the Timurids become really famous is one of Timur's descendants, Babur, in 1526 goes on to start the process of founding the Mughal dynasty and the Mughal Empire in kind of the Delhi-an heartland of northern India. And that actually survives all the way up until 1857, when the British Empire dissolves what is left of their non-fully administered Indian territories into the British Raj, which is the foundation of modern-day India. So we're kind of the progenitor of the progenitor of the progenitor here is what we're talking about. And our basic fork is, so Tamerlane dies in 1405, catches a fever. What if, and we've got kind of two options, so we'll discuss quickly exactly what the fork is, but basically, what if somehow Tamerlane either more formally sets out his succession plan or lives a little bit longer and does that and kind of gets his house in order so that the Timurid Empire might somehow last a little bit longer? And what is that going to do to sort of, Persia and sort of the Oxanian region with all of the other things that are going on around it in the 1400s and 1500s? So, Evan, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of what you think Timur might do in terms of the succession stuff? Because I know that's really kind of the crux of how this fork is going to work.
Yeah, totally. So what we kind of posited and talked about before we hopped on air is I don't think giving Tamerlane a couple more years really necessarily changes his outlook on who he prefers as successor. I think what it does is it kind of gives him a little more time and stability and credibility to actually, stop clicking X on those trellis notifications telling him to get the succession plan written. I assume the Ming campaign goes well enough to, it is in the winter, but we also have to keep in mind that the Ming is, rising from the ashes of, I believe, the Yuan dynasty immediately preceding them. They're kind of on the ascendancy. They're kind of on the upswing. And I mean, that's kind of why this whole personal spat happened in the first place, is because the Ming emperor viewed the Timurs as like a sort of, backwater, ally, not really even that, like just, okay, yeah,
just
you guys
some upstarts from the backwoods who are
upstarts from the
pretending
backwoods
like they're civilized.
Exactly right. And so, of course, Timur is very offended by this and is out to teach them a lesson. But I think unlike prior campaigns and prior, what the Mongols are used to doing, because keep in mind, the Timurids are basically they're Mongols. That's who they are originally, but they are trying to claim this mantle of some sort of weird syncretic Turkish, Persian, Islamic, Mongolian kind of fusion, like any kind of Middle Eastern identity, in the area, minus like just purely Arabs, ethnicity or Egyptians or whatever. They're trying to claim that mantle. Like
so
at this
Timur
point.
does not call him. So Timur does very specifically does not call himself a caliph, because that's reserved for the descendants of Muhammad.
And he also can't call himself a Khan.
He also doesn't call himself a Khan because he's not a descendant of Genghis.
Yeah.
So he ends up calling himself, I believe, an emir, which is like a prince.
Yeah.
So he's really
I guess that means
thread the needle here.
Right. Well, he is, and he marries one of Genghis's daughters to try and claim like that side of a legitimacy.
Yeah.
He tries to take on the title like Sword of Islam.
It's the old marry into the family if you're not born into it trick.
Precisely, exactly, the backdoor loophole. But I guess we can say that because he couldn't claim himself to be a ruler of a khanate, that means he's not a con man.
Oh, ooh, I love it.
Oh boy, I don't have Chris to like hit the mute button on me here. So anyway, but what we have going on is essentially what I'm trying to. We're on a Discord call right now, and
we got sound effects for a little bit.
We actually got a little bit of the air horn sound effect there. Probably a first for the podcast. I don't know if that's ever been done before. But anyway, I guess what I'm trying to build up to is this. Timur, unlike his past conquests, which were more so political nature, empire building, consolidation purposes, this is more of a personal spat. This is him trying to extract his pound of flesh from the Ming. So I would say given that he is like, I think in his like mid to late 60s at this point.
Yeah, he's pushing 70, if not just over it.
Pushing 70, if not just over it. He is probably, again, the whole premise of this fork is that he is starting to click on and open the trellis notification and actually take care of it. He's starting to think about his succession plan. So I think this will be like his last grand hurrah. Like he will be satisfied with maybe taking a couple of small territories or towns, important outposts on the Silk Road, which we'll get into, I'm sure, a lot more when we talk about the Silk Road and different implications of the Timur Empire lasting longer later in the episode. But I don't think it's going to be, first of all, possible at this point for the Timurids to just completely overrun and take over the Ming, because the Ming are an ascendant power in their own right. But I also think with just the nature of the dispute being more personal in nature, Timur kind of coming to the end of his reign, the end of his life, and the Ming emperor himself also probably being very quick to realize, okay, whoa, I messed up here. I don't want to have to deal with problems on the Western Front. here, just take my stuff and go, please. I don't want to bother you. I don't want to deal with you. I was wrong to call you a hick from Alabama, from Alabamistan. You're actually an Emmer in your own right. So I think that's kind of how that campaign is largely going to go. And so basically what we now have is by the end of Timur's reign, we give him an extra couple years, wrap up his main campaign, get a couple of, outposts on the Silk Road, and they have now a succession plan that maybe is not to the, the royal court's liking per se, but it's what Timur says, it's what he wants, and whatever Timur wants, Timur gets, kind of attitude. Instead of it being more of an accidental, oh, dude dropped dead of fever while fighting the Ming, now this grandson that nobody likes is just going to get completely overrun while sitting in his palace in Samarkand. And I think that does change things a little bit. Now, I think moving forward, Dylan, as we also discussed in the pre-podcast, it may not necessarily matter as much for the Timurids' ultimate fate and ultimate success or not, who is actually on the throne in the end immediately here, because the simple fact that Timur is able to tie up these loose ends is going to be a very stabilizing force for the empire moving forward.
Yeah, because one of the things that the Timurids are just the last kind of example of in our timeline is this sort of Mongol system of succession. It's the same exact thing that happened to Genghis Khan when, famously, if you guys remember our sort of Genghis episode Chris and I did a while back, Genghis dies with kind of an heir presumptive, but not a formal heir, and this is perfectly normal in the Mongol tradition. It's much like Charlemagne and the Frankish system of inheritance, where all the sons will split the territories of the father, and they will each take their own kingdoms. This is how, after the Mongol Empire, quote unquote, dissolves, you have the Chagatai, you have the Ilkhanate, you have the Golden Horde, and you have the one that I can't think about or can't remember that ends up being how Kublai Khan founds the Yuan dynasty in China. He's the fourth one that I can't remember. He ends up leading. And basically, Genghis' sons have three Mongol Khanates.
The Yuan dynasty that Evan was talking about.
Yeah, that's what it becomes. I just can't remember the initial name after of the Genghis, the fourth son who Kublai was descended from. But yeah, it ends up being the Yuan dynasty in China. So that's the system.
I thought Kublai ran Yuan, was the head.
No, he did, but he was a grandson of Genghis, so his dad got something, and I just can't remember what that was called.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But yes, it turns into the Yuan dynasty. But that's the system that the Mongols and the Mongolic kind of, culture tends to do. So that's what we're trying to get Timur to not do, is establish a firm successor so that this doesn't split into either a bunch of smaller kingdoms or have this kind of internecine succession war between the brothers and the cousins and the relatives like we see in our timeline. So I think, his successor in our timeline was Pir Muhammad, who was, like we talked about, grandson number 2 of son number 2. And nobody amongst the rest of the family really likes Pir Muhammad, but part of that is probably because everybody kind of unofficially knows he's the heir, but there is no official designation. So when Timur dies, Pir Muhammad is the new Timurid emperor, but his uncle Shahrukh decides he's tired of his low-level administrative post and comes out of the woodwork. His cousin Khalil Sultan, who's one of the big military commanders, comes out of the woodwork. And if you have Pir Muhammad being the formal designated successor, maybe with like a testament of Lenin-style dig at some of the other guys where Timur says, oh yes, Shahrukh is too meek, he is not worth governing, and he can't be trusted, and blah, blah, and Khalil Sultan is too bloodthirsty. Some stuff like that gets thrown into the proclamation to basically solidify Pir Muhammad as the successor. Maybe that there's still going to be some, there's going to be a couple cousins here or there who are like, no, I want it. Granddad said 6 years ago at some drunk barroom party that I could have it when he dies. That kind of stuff. But if Pir Muhammad's got a better base of support and a more solid buy-in, from the rest of the family, even if he's going to have to deal with it, it doesn't break out into an all-out struggle for the throne. It's just, he's got to clamp down on some people, teach him who's really boss, and then things are back to normal. And the advantage of Pir Muhammad is, as a grandson of Timur, he's old enough to have participated in military action and to have established a name for himself, but he's young enough that if he does sit on the throne and he can keep, things under control, he's going to be there for a while. So he has the prospective advantage of potential stability. It's not, in our timeline, you end up only having a Timurid emperor for like 10 or 15 years, and then there's one for 4, and then there's one for 7, and then there's one for 10. But if you have a grandson directly appointed as the heir, you're potentially looking at one ruler for upwards of 20, maybe even 30 years, which presents a possibility for more stability at the outset that we didn't see in our timeline and didn't get to experience. So I think that sets up some really interesting possibilities for the larger impact of a more stable Timurid Empire if you have a longer term successor.
Yeah, and I think that is going to be very interesting playing out juxtaposed to and right next to the Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottoman Empire at this point of time is kind of in shambles, in the same way that Tamerlane, Timur, and the Ming Emperor got into some personal kerfuffle about personal matters, and that ended up precipitating a conflict. For that same reason, the Ottomans got destroyed. The Sultan at the time, Bayezid, I think was his name, Bayezid and Timur were basically pen pals, except that they were exchanging hate mail. And they were basically just constantly roasting each other from their various empires. It's actually quite funny. They would literally send each other letters where they would just repeatedly insult each other like it was a roast. And this went on, and then eventually Timur got tired of it and ended up destroying him in the Battle of Ankara. So at this present time, the Ottoman Empire is not what we conceive it to be. However, they do take time. They do go and, they have their whole interregnum where they reshuffle things, they reorganize, and eventually they come back and they recover from their defeat at Timur.
Within 50 years, they mop up the rest of the remnants of the Byzantine Empire and conquer Constantinople.
Yeah.
So it's not that long for the Ottomans to be able to actually get past the Taylor Swift versus Katy Perry era, the Drake versus Kendrick era between their emperors. Yeah.
Well, and the Timurid versus Ottoman thing goes back to sort of the Turkic origins of the Ottomans. So short trip 300 more years back in history. The Ottomans got their start under Osman I as some of the beyliks, the sort of tribal honestly kind of marches, to use a medieval sort of territorial term, where these are the frontline sort of vassals of the overlord empire, in this case the Seljuk Turks, when the Seljuks initially started knocking down the Byzantines. And then after the Battle of Manzikert, which really was kind of the death knell to the overall Byzantine Empire, the Ottomans started to be like, hey, no, actually we're our own thing, not your thing. And that's how the Ottomans got started. So Timur wants to, as a descendant of the kind of Turkic steppe conquerors like the Mongols, wants to restore the Seljuk sort of control of kind of Anatolia. That's why he goes up and conquers Anatolia. So that's the sort of where this bad beef with the Ottomans kind of comes from, is because they overthrew great granddad's best buddy, who was the tribal chieftain, 200 years ago. But as Timur's descendants go along, and this is, at the outset, there's still going to be the bad blood, obviously, but as time goes on, that's going to be less and less remembered. So eventually, I don't think the Ottomans and the Timurids are going to be friends, but the old grudges are going to mean less in the context of the modern situation that these guys find themselves in, 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line. And I think initially, the Ottomans probably don't have their house in order, and Pir Muhammad, even though he has control, isn't going to have his house in as much order as he would like. So at least for the 10, 12 years of the Ottoman interregnum, there's probably not that much militarily that's going to be back and forth, maybe a little bit, but I think Pir Muhammad's more going to be focused on India, which is sort of his father's most recent successful conquests in and around Delhi. So I think,
and I mean, two things to kind of keep in mind here as well is, first of all, like with the Ottoman Turks being able to claim more of the, quote unquote Turkic mantle for themselves over time, and really the Timurids being more, explicitly like Mongolian in their roots. Dylan and I had an interesting conversation in the pre-podcast where we basically talked about how the Mongolian conquerors conquered, large swaths of territory because of their military prowess and skill set, but they were essentially a set of nomadic tribesmen. They basically, the only people that have less culture built into them than the Mongolians are white people. But like, okay, by the way, that was a joke. All of us on this podcast are white, so I'm able to make that joke. But anyway, so like the Mongols themselves, the point I'm trying to make is that the Mongols themselves didn't really bring their own culture when they conquered, because there wasn't much to bring.
Yeah. Or they didn't enforce it, I guess is the better phrase.
They didn't really enforce it, is probably the better way of saying it. And over time, a lot of these khanates kind of developed their own syncretic, cultures where they adopted a lot of the local customs. And in the Timurids' case, it was Islam, from the Seljuk Turks, and also just, of course, the areas that they conquered,
they took a lot of Persian customs, and they
took a lot of those Persian customs.
Persian, I think, was the court language.
I believe you're right there, Dylan. Yeah. So with this in mind, and also keep in mind that at this point, in our timeline, and I think would still probably happen in the alternate timeline as well, we have I'm going to try and pronounce this, and I'm probably just going to butcher it horribly, the Ak Konyunlu, I think. Koyunlu?
The Ak Koyunlu?
Yeah, they go by the White Sheep Turkomans, and I think that's not only a more epic name, but a funnier name, and I'm just going to refer to them as that, the White Sheep Turkomans. They're a confederacy that basically rises up in, what is kind of seen as like the ancient Babylonian heartland, Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran, those areas. So they rise up, and in our timeline, they kind of push the Timurids out and are able to kind of do their own thing for a little while, until the Ottomans eventually kind of steamroll them later down the line. But what I'm setting up here is the more Mongol syncretic, Timurid Empire is already kind of leaning towards and gaining more cultural influence from their Silk Road outposts that they have from China, the riches also that are flowing through them, flowing into their coffers, their cultural traditions, and their money. You also have their toehold that they're still holding on to in India, which is, a very diverse culture and country, with the Hindu population there. So over time, the pressures are kind of pushing the Ottomans, once they do mop-up duty with the Byzantines, once they take over the Balkans, once they have Hotel Transylvania under their own possession, as a vassal state, they're kind of looking a little bit towards the east. And they're like, okay, we have a little bit of bad blood, a little bit of history between, us and the Timurids, which are still around. They're still pretty strong. They have their own Persian, customs and everything. But hey, we also have this buffer state that's kind of conveniently come up between us, the White Sheep Turkomans. They can do their thing. And in fact, we don't even necessarily have to take them over. We can just make them a vassal or just like heavily influence them or whatever. But having them as a buffer between us serves our purposes pretty well. So, and then the Timurids, on the other hand, they are just going to do what makes them money, and they are going to do what gives them power and influence. They are more than happy to just let some of the more, my granddad spoke Persian in the Persian court, and now we're kind of picking up A little bit more of a Chinese dialect. We're also maybe picking up a little bit more of Hindi here and there. Over time, it's just a natural progression of that society and of that culture. They might shift a little bit more their focus towards the east.
Well, and the other thing, speaking of the kind of syncretism that Mongols tended to have, it's very similar to not kind of the initial Muslim expansion out of Arabia, but once you start seeing the Moors get into Iberia, it's kind of a very similar thing where they've got their rules, you follow them, but basically as long as you pay your taxes and don't cause trouble, culturally they're happy to kind of blend and pick from the best of both worlds as long as it doesn't cause too many problems. The other interesting thing about that, especially at this time period in the territory that we're talking about for the Timurids, is shortly after this whole Ming dust-up with Timur starts off, the Ming emperor sends probably one of the most famous non-European exploratory missions in history off on its wild adventure. And that is the trade voyages of Zheng He and his giant, massive trade ships that won't be rivaled by European standards until basically you get the Bismarck in World War I. Basically, it's essentially this Chinese trade exploratory mission throughout Indonesia and India that's dozens and dozens of ships. Actually, I think it's actually hundreds. And these ships are like 2 or 3 times, on average, the size of most European caravels of the time period. And a lot of the cities that Zheng He visited, he kind of ropes around India, lands in some of these cities on the kind of western Indian coast and in Persia, and then sneaks up around Arabia and goes up the Red Sea into kind of Egypt. So if you have a Chinese trade exploratory mission led by all these Chinese ambassadors, these Chinese traders who are going to be bringing with them Chinese goods, Chinese philosophy, Chinese ideas, if they land in a Timurid series of trade ports, that's going to open up the Timurids to much more direct or less indirect Chinese exposure and Oriental exposure than the Ottomans really were able to get. Because at this time, the Ottomans did not have the Egyptian territories that we kind of understand of sort of the heyday of the Ottoman Empire. So they're not going to get this level of Chinese exposure that the Timurids would probably get. So I think that's another thing that sort of starts the split of the Ottomans go west, the Timurids kind of go back east, not necessarily in terms of outright intention, but the cultural sort of diaspora and expansion and shift is going to start to diverge them kind of their different ways.
Yeah,
and
I think one thing to consider though is that, like, we're drawing comparisons between the Moors and the Timurids, which is fair in terms of both of them being both of them observing, cultural syncretism. But I think overall there's a big distinction to make, which is that the Moors were not nearly as genocidal as the Timurids. The Timurids killed millions.
Oh,
of
100%. Yeah.
The Moors by comparison, the Moors were fairies. I mean, they were beautiful in comparison to the Timurids. They share that same cultural syncretism, but I think to assume that there would be that other adjacent and surrounding cultures would be as open to exchange with the Timurids as they were to the Moors, I think is a stretch, just on the grounds that there was immense fear of the Timurids, and there would have been great reticence to engage with them on anything substantial.
That's a fair point. And I guess I was more coming at it in the sense of kind of the old classic Mongol and kind of the Yuan court of where they will, people of merit, the Yuan court, if you had merit, you could pretty much work your way up, with work being kind of a loose usage of the word. Genghis had the same concept, but you didn't work, you were just taken and you died, or you did the thing you were good at. But either way, it's this.
Basically, if you were lucky enough to survive the initial mass genocide, you were probably fine.
Yeah. So it's
you still had to survive the mass genocide.
But it's that at least recognition of there is a cream of the crop, and at a certain point, once you're of a certain level of skill and aptitude, wherever you're from, whatever your culture, you have utility, therefore that's an inroad that then starts to spread things throughout the Mongol court, or the Timurid court in this case.
Yeah. Now, something that I think is pretty interesting from this is, like we established in the background, Babur, who is a great, maybe another great, but like definitely at least three greats, like grandson of Timur in our timeline, he ends up founding, the Mughal Empire, which is in like most of northern India, like all of the important cities in northern India. And as Dylan excellently set up, that lasted until well into the 1800s, and that was the main entity that the British Raj took over and co-opted. So if we have the Timurid Empire being led either by Babur or by somebody else who is still also administering like this territory and kind of pushing into this territory, then what does this mean for, say, the Age of Exploration? Because in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue primarily because he was trying to find a western way to India and Indonesia and like all of that kind of area, but basically Asia, but mostly India and Indonesia kind of areas. So what Kai presents is a very interesting point along those lines. If we have the Timurids still kicking, still, around, and they have their reputation that precedes them. Now, whether or not they actually still maintain their, great granddad's, Mongolian genocidal war tactics or not, they may still have a reputation which the Europeans, like the Portuguese, maybe necessarily don't want to super work with. Like the Moors in comparison, the Europeans had a pretty big hissy fit and really wanted to kick the Moors out for a long time. I mean, you have the Reconquista, you have all of that. For a while, it was pretty chill. The Moors were overseeing things, but it wasn't that big a deal. But it ended up becoming more of like a cultural, the Christians got to kick out the Muslims from Iberia.
And that's basically what it was. It was the reason why they wanted to kick the Moors out was because they weren't Christian. It really was not because they were committing genocide or
no, it was not. It was purely a religious thing.
Yeah.
Right. So when you have a genocidal people who have that history or have that reputation, and whether or not they're even mainly Islamic at this point, they're just something that we as European Christians don't like, whether it's Hindu, whether it's Chinese, whether it's just a mix of all three. That does present an interesting point of what might this do to European expansion efforts.
Yeah, because the idea is, so right around when Columbus starts sailing and the Portuguese especially start going around the Horn of Africa, this is kind of when the Ottomans really start to get a chokehold over both the Black Sea and Egypt, which are the two primary ways through which Silk Road trade can, and I'm going to emphasize this word, easily get through to European markets. European crusaders learned about all this magic Indian spice and then famously took it back to England only to make beans on toast be basically the national dish. Just kidding. I love English food. I just have to get that dig in there because that's kind of the stereotypical dig at English food is you conquer half the world to get spices and then use none of it. But
as someone who has been to England, I will stand up in their defense and say their food is not the best, but it is not as bad as people.
No, 100% no. Yeah. But basically those
Scandinavia would like to enter the chat.
Oh, let's not.
There is a play.
Let's not talk about lutefisk.
Yeah, they can. Oh gosh, I've heard too many horror stories.
Yeah, surströmming.
They can make good pastries and they can make good desserts, but there's a reason why you don't see Norwegian food restaurants pop up across the United States. It's just
But what I'm basically
sorry, guys.
No. It's a good detour. I always love talking about food. But what I'm if the Timurids control this kind of western sort of coast of India and sort of the Persian trade ports, that is primarily where Magellan and a lot of the Portuguese traders were trying to go to circumvent the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans have the Black Sea and the Mediterranean kind of locked down. And it's not that they weren't selling it. It's just they were putting a markup on it. And this being the age of mercantilism, the merchants, why pay more when you can pay less? If regardless of whether you have to send thousands of people on dangerous exploratory missions and they never come back. So that's why the Portuguese are going around the Horn of Africa. But if those ports where the Portuguese are going to are under control of a perceived genocidal, to Kai's point, consolidated Muslim-esque, depending on how much the Indian side bleeds into the sort of Persian Timurid side, all of that. If they're facing basically a united front, they may not want to go there. And even if they want to go there, they may not perceive it as necessarily being as worth the investment, because if it's a combination of extra danger and you don't know exactly what you're getting when you get there, and you don't know if you're even going to be able to get anything, the Portuguese will probably still try it because they're kind of naturally closest to Africa, so they can experiment with bouncing around. But the idea of doing a completely uncharted adventure straight west to find the Indies may have less appeal when you don't know that there's going to be a payday at the end of it. So why would you risk it? So I think,
yes.
On the one hand, I think that means, unfortunately for Africa, who is, most obviously gotten the short end of every stick in the colonial game of European powers, I think that means Africa is going to end up being probably more colonized. And by colonized, I basically mean enslaved in this timeline. I can see the discovery of South America still happening at some point because the Portuguese just do that by accident. But I don't think you have the same sort of, like we've talked about in our Columbus episode previously, the Spanish land in the Caribbean and from there have a shotgun start to basically the entirety of the New World. I think it's that part, if it happens at all, happens way further down the line. And I think there's a more natural reticence, at least until the Portuguese can get South America sort of more built up and off the ground, for the rest of the European powers to even try to attempt something like this. They're going to think that I honestly wonder if the Portuguese are kind of going to become sort of, at least in the sense of the Silk Road trade, kind of Ottomans light, where instead of the Ottomans having a chokehold, once the Portuguese find some way to get around, they end up having kind of the chokehold, and all the
I was just going to say that.
The European powers essentially have to choose between the Islamic Ottomans and the Catholic Portuguese, who are both going to charge a markup. They're just going to go with the Portuguese instead.
You're going to go for the Portuguese because at least they're the same religion, or nominally Christian, the same-ish religion, versus a completely different power and a completely different religion, which, ultimately in the end, I could see this developing as a possibility as well. I could see the focus of the conflict, or rather of expansion, as you said, Dylan, being more focused on Africa sooner, the Western world, North and South America, being further down the line, which would have immense possible implications that we kind of talked a lot about those with the Christopher Columbus episode. Yeah. So I'm not going to repeat them here. But, suffice it to say, what I'm leading up towards is, we end up with, like, I think it was, I forget exactly when this was, because this is just things I've heard bits and pieces about, and I want to read more into with world history. But like with the Ottomans at the gates of Vienna, and getting turned back, like they have the Balkans, they have a significant portion of Europe. Is this kind of going to lead to just more of a period where the Europeans focus either almost exclusively on developing Africa, enslaving Africa, and gearing up for Ottoman War II Electric Boogaloo? Like, is it going to be more of this religious conflict and religious focus? Because, hey, what do the Ottomans have? They have the Holy Land, right? We have those old grudges with, the Catholic Church and the Crusades and everything that in world history parlance wasn't actually all that horribly long ago at this point. You have to remember, like, that was, 200-300 years before the time period that we're talking about. ish, roughly. Yeah, I mean, the beginning is probably like in 1000 AD, roughly. So like 500 years, but like the end of it, like that goes on for like 300 years. So it would be very interesting to me to see, possibly in the end, much less, little, if not almost no focus on India, because that's seen as like untouchable. That's seen as, okay, that's a giant gray zone area. We don't know what's going on. I mean, maybe a bit more of a focus on China, possibly.
Well, or the other thing that I think of is, because this is also this this hypothetical sort of chokehold by the Portuguese, of the sort of Silk Road trade and consequential discovery of South America is not that much further up the timeline from the Reformation. So I almost wonder if the age of exploration ends up either causing or turning into kind of this age of not Reformation in sort of the theological sense of the word, but Reformation used to connote the sort of the conflicts both on the continent and in the sort of explorational sort of sending ships everywhere. The race between Protestants and Catholics to try and figure out how to get economic advantage out of this New World stuff. So it's less of the Portuguese versus the Spanish, and then everybody else trying to get in just straight because of the gold mine, both literally and figuratively, but more the Catholic Portuguese versus, say, the Anglican English, because Francis Drake is right around the corner, and he's the most famous explorer in English history. If the age of exploration takes a more overt geopolitical Protestant versus Catholic bent, that could mean you see something like the 30 Years' War jump up, at least a couple decades in time over some of the colonial exploits of kind of Northern Europe versus Catholic Southern Europe. And what that then does, for a couple of years of colonial history, that just completely upends the sort of geopolitical map.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
I just to push back a little bit on this notion of the European powers not being willing to touch India due to a unified Timurid empire that encompasses the Mughal Empire. We should keep in mind that the Portuguese actually initially they were not in contact with the Mughal Empire when they first landed in India. They landed in
they were further
Calicut,
south,
which
right?
is not part. Yeah, they landed in the south of India, which was not under Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire stretches in the northern parts of India, Pakistan. It's not down in the southern areas of India. So I think, of course, the Portuguese do eventually, as one would invariably do expanding in India, eventually run into the Mughals. And so they would eventually have to contend with that. And that would certainly alter the way in which India becomes colonized. Portugal never really conquered the entirety of India, but Britain later did.
Yeah.
And kind of built off of Portuguese roadmaps. But essentially, I think it has profound impacts on the expansion of colonial powers into India, but I don't think it materially affects the initial planting of Europe in India.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, Goa and Calicut are not part of the Mughal Empire at this time and never will be.
Yeah. And I guess what I meant when I was talking about that is I think at some point, because of how India, I think at some point the Timurids are going to fracture over the next 500 years. I mean, it's unrealistic to expect an empire to last that long completely, in whole cloth. I do think the calculus changes a little bit, but I think from the colonization perspective, it's at least, my kind of knock on what ifs tend to be more towards, whoever colonizes India, somebody's going to do it because it's too juicy not to take. But the unexplored North America and South America kind of are the more abstract, interesting changes in development. But yeah, you're right. I think India at some point, somebody's going to get it. The Portuguese, it's not their style. Maybe that's where the Spanish go primarily instead of to the West Indies, because the Spanish colonial resource extraction style of colonialism, I would think, might work
Not to mention they're being able to take on the mantle of Christianity, against a presumptively Muslim empire. Like that would be something that I think could be up the Spanish's alley. I think something that has not really been mentioned, or the concept that I just want to kind of name drop here as well and see how this possibly changes things as well, is really what this fork mostly boils down to is what would happen if the Timurids become an additional, or in fact kind of to supplant our understanding and our timeline of the what the Mughal Empire was. What if the Timurids were the ones who are actually part of the big Islamic gunpowder empires?
Yeah.
That's what I think really this fork comes down to. And at first it might not seem like it necessarily changes a ton, but I mean, the fact that we've been opining for almost an hour here, and we'll probably start bringing this to somewhat of a landing here. Proceeds to talk for 25 more minutes. But just kind of thinking really what these, forks and the tributaries of the river of time might end up becoming is, does, Europe's point of view change with, let's say we have, I mean, it could be even like 2 major Islamic gunpowder empires. Maybe it's still 3 because you have the Ottomans, you have the, we'll just for sake of argument call them the Timurids / Mughals, because they're in that area. And then we have, the kind of the start of modern Iranian history with like the Safavid Empire, because I know we gave that area over to the White Sheep Turkomans a little while back, but I don't think the Safavids are not going to develop as a result of this timeline. So do we have 4 gunpowder empires, 2, 3? How does that necessarily completely change things? And I think, Dylan, you presenting the Portuguese choke point and South America being not that, when you look at a world map, like comparatively speaking, it's a stone's toss across from Africa compared to how far North America is from, mainland Europe. So how does that change the age of exploration? Where do these European powers go? How do the Muslim empires respond and react? And the Reformation too. Again, another thing that I think was really important to be brought up here as well. How does that necessarily change the Reformation? Because England up until a certain point is a Catholic power. And, Germany up until a certain point, still trying to claim the mantle of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as we always like to say on this show, is not holy, not Roman, and not an empire.
Yeah.
So that's just, I think, a lot of the knock-on effects that really happen as a result of this trellis notification finally being opened.
Yeah, I have one final completely unserious thought, and I will close my thoughts on this, and that is to make up for the insults we have done to the Scandinavian people on this podcast. I'm going to say Protestant colonization of the New World starts with the Scandinavians rediscovering the old Viking route from Iceland to Greenland to Nova Scotia. And the at this time it would have been Sweden, because I think they had a personal union with Norway and with Denmark. But anyway, the Scandinavians take over Vinland and resurrect it as a Protestant Scandinavian colonial exploit in the New World.
Now that is something I could definitely see.
So at the end of the day, what that means is the Scandinavians can thus take credit on the world culinary stage for the glory of poutine.
I see. I mean, can we eventually get them to right the wrong of Iceland being green and Greenland being ice?
No, but I think that does make it, instead of Timmy's, it makes it Olaf Hortons.
Sven Hortons.
Yes, Sven Hortons.
Oh, yeah. No, that would be very interesting. And hey, like New York, I mean, and maybe I'm just misremembering this, but I think New York.
Yeah, New Oslo.
Yeah, New Oslo. Or it stays, because I think it was Dutch at one point.
Oh yeah, it was originally New Netherlands.
It was Amsterdam originally, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I thought Sweden was in there somewhere as well, but
Yeah,
maybe
they had a couple. They had a
probably.
couple spots in New England, I think, but nothing ever major.
I think so. Yeah, nothing huge. So like, yeah, the Vikings rise up once again along their old trade routes and actually are the progenitors.
I have it. So there's a region of Sweden called Upland. Canada is the far north of North America. So we just take Upland and make all of Scandinavian Canada literal upland.
Literal upland. New upland.
New Upland.
Yeah.
That's catchy. I like that.
That is a pretty interesting world that we've just created. All right. Well, Kai, do you have any parting thoughts for us?
Not really. I'm always blown away by our ability to turn this back into a colonial European-centric episode with hints of the Reformation and European monarchy, which I think is an excellent feature.
It was the closest I could come to satisfying Chris Coppola's thirst for economic theory. We had to, throw the Reformation in as kind of a backup plan.
Yes, and I mean, really, the only way that I think we could get economic theory thrown in here is if we talked about mercantilist policies with the Silk Road.
I think the Silk Road is rife with economic analysis and why it closed, for example.
Yeah,
would have essentially amounted to tariffs or transitory tariffs through the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. There's a lot to chew on there, and we can chew on it now but we shan't.
Yeah, exactly. You know what? Chris is just going to have his ultimate revenge, and he'll come back for a part 2, but it'll be a solo episode where he only discusses the economic reasons for the collapse of the Silk Road.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's gonna be his revenge for not being on here today, and for Dylan stealing his intro.
Yeah, Chris.
Sorry. Legally appropriating under the fair use clause.
Yeah, it is fair use. I stand by that.
Well, for anyone who is filling out that bingo card that I submitted on the Discord a while back, they're going to not like this episode because we've had almost no interruptions. We've had very few very little economic analysis. Crucially, we've had no threats of a second part.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Crucial.
No, we've wrapped this up pretty well. And I mean, we have had liberal references to me for the pre-podcast, but I mean, that happens basically every show. In fact, that should probably be just the free spot on the A Fork in Time bingo card. We always talk about what we say in the pre-podcast.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think with all of that out of the way, I think now is about as good a time as any for me to assume the closing duties, which is typically what I kind of end up doing, no matter if I open and host or not. But if you all enjoyed this show, feel free to sound off in our Discord and let us know what you think. There's, with a topic as kind of broad and wide-ranging as this, there are probably things that we missed or other things that we might not have considered, or you might disagree with our interpretation, or you might agree and would be interested in following this later on down the timeline and its knock-on effects. But with all that being said, thanks again for tuning in. And as we tend to like to end our show, I almost gave the ending of my own podcasts right there because I have been so used to recording that recently. Shameless plug, but yeah, I have my own personal project. You should check it out. But anyway, as we like to end this show, if we stumble across a fork in the Silk Road, what do you think we should do with that?
Take it.
Take it, make it into a feature written by Marco Polo.
Yes.
Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.